Right. Well, as I always say, if you want to age-proof your life, you need to leak-proof your gut. So, you know, we know that inflammation is probably one of the commonest underlying factor in aging. Most chronic diseases, there's always what we call a downstream factor of inflammation. So inflammation is usually the issue in most aging processes, in most chronic diseases. There's inflammation there. And the commonest source of inflammation is the gut. You know, we talk about anti-aging, anti-inflammatory foods and pro-inflammatory foods, and yes, that's the case. But the main source of your inflammation comes from the gut if you've got a leaky gut. So I would assume your listeners know what a leaky gut, but if if you don't know what a leaky gut is, you do get some damage to the gut lining, which is very, very thin. And the gut, remember, the gut lining is your barrier to the external world, and that gets damaged easily, and the tight junctions between the cells can loosen. And that often happens when there's an altered microbiome, and we get an altered microbiome quite easily with the way we live our lives these days, with the types of foods we eat, too many antibiotics we take, which carpet bomb our guts, the PPIs and other medications. So we get damage to the gut wall, and then we have metabolites of some bacteria, we have toxins, we have breakdown of food products that actually go through these tight junctions when it's a little bit what we call leaky, when the wall is a bit permeable, and it goes into our bloodstream and triggers inflammation. And the inflammation can affect all parts of your body. So to me, leak-proofing your gut is probably one of the most important things you can do for aging, because it will decrease the amount of inflammation.
Okay. So what can we be doing to achieve a healthy gut? What are some things that we should be avoiding, and what foods should we focus more on?
Sure. So the biggest foods are the sugars, the starches. Gluten is a huge, huge problem. Now, there's a test that I do in my office called the wheat zoomer, which measures 13 different antigens to gluten, because it's not in celiac test, they just measure, I think, 3 or 4, but there are all these different antigens, and almost everyone I test, it actually has some sensitivity to 1 or 2 at least of the antigens, and then it can actually measure if they have some intestinal permeability. And a lot of people, if not most, have either the beginnings or some intestinal permeability. So I think sugar, starches, and gluten would be the foods up there, but if you sensitive, some people are sensitive to dairy. I mean, that's not everyone, but grains can be a problem. And then I think factory farm meats are a big problem because of all the antibiotics in there, which can affect the microbiome. And then one issue that's not discussed often enough, but I would imagine on your show has been discussed, is the glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup. But it's not just on genetically modified organisms. Glyphosate is sprayed on most grains and beans in America to help the drying process. And glyphosate also happens to be a registered antibiotic. So, and it's permeated the American food system. So we have a problem where a lot of the foods we're eating, so the glyphosate that's sprayed on all these grains, and then the sugar and the starches and the gluten, and then artificial sweeteners can affect your microbiome. Artificial ingredients can affect your microbiome. So you really got to be very careful with what you eat, because over time that will affect this microbiome and then affect the lining of the gut. So those would be, I know it sounds drastic to a lot of people, but those would be the foods to avoid as much as possible. You don't have to be perfect, but if you're sensitive to gluten, sometimes you do need to be fairly perfect. But for the most part, you need to cut back on those foods as much as possible. And then the foods to eat, varies, because if someone's got an altered microbiome, sometimes fermented foods actually make it a little bit worse. Not that fermented foods are bad for you. Fermented foods are good bacteria. But if you have an overgrowth of yeast, for instance, and you have fermented foods, it makes it worse. It makes you get more gas. So I tend to encourage people to eat prebiotics, which are actually the fiber that you don't digest, and then that feeds the good bacteria. So I always talk about, eating the stalks and stems. So the part of the broccoli or asparagus that you normally throw away, eat those, because your body's not going to break them down properly. So that feeds the bacteria. Sometimes a probiotic, sometimes fermented foods help, but as I said, sometimes it doesn't. And, just eat a clean diet. Eat as close to nature as possible. It's the altered foods that tend to be a problem. So if you are going to eat meat, eat grass-fed, grass-finished meat. If you're going to eat, eggs or chicken, eat organic, farm pastured eggs and pastured chickens, and try get organic vegetables. I know it's not practical for everyone, but ewg.org, environmental working group, ewg.org, has a nice list of the most of the vegetables with the most pesticides on, and the ones with the least. There are ways of getting around it, and I talk about it all in all my books. So it's easy information to get.
Yeah, I think everything you mentioned there, those are really good universal kind of truths when it comes to nutrition. And I know something you've said before, that it's not like there's one specific diet for everybody. It's something that you, in a way, have to experiment with certain foods to see what works with you and what doesn't. Because we're not all going to be eating the same food across the board.
Right. So I used to eat a more of a paleo, animal protein heavy diet, because I did well with it. I was pre-diabetic years ago, from eating tons of grains and fruits, and so I switched to a paleo diet, and my numbers reversed, and I felt so much better, and that was great. And then I started researching aging, and there's quite a bit of research about MTOR, which maybe your readers probably have heard about. It's one of the longevity gene regulators, and how you want this protein complex of MTOR to, when you're young, you want it because it's about growth and getting strong and reproducing. But when you get older, you don't want that MTOR to be stimulated. And animal protein is one of those things that's stimulated. So someone like you, animal protein is great. Someone like me, I have cut down. It's not that I stopped, but I don't have animal protein 2 meals a day. I have animal protein maybe 1 meal a day, probably 1 meal every second day.
What is it about the MTOR that is not good for older folks? I'm sorry if I missed that.
Yeah, so, MTOR is a protein complex that actually it stimulates growth and reproduction. And so when you're older, you don't want too much cellular growth, because it's going to cause too much waste product, and our cleansing mechanisms decrease when we grow older. So you don't want too much cellular growth, because it can end up growing cancer. So that's a fine balance. I'm not saying you shouldn't eat animal protein, because the tricky part becomes as you get older and you start losing muscle mass. The best thing for muscle mass is actually animal protein. So it's a fine balance. But the point is, I think from eating maybe 2 meals of animal protein a day, I've eat maybe one a day, or one every second day. I mean, I only eat 2 meals a day anyways, so it's pretty easy.
Yeah.
So that eating less is probably one of the best things you can do as you get older too, and that's good for MTOR. The MTOR. When you're eating a lot and you're growing, your MTOR is in full throttle, which is great when you're younger, but you don't want it in full throttle when you're older. So fasting is good, eating less is good, and definitely eating less protein, and definitely carbs as well. I mean, carbs, sugar and starches. So you adjust. It's not, there's no one way. You've got to find what works for you.